Picture this. You have just inherited a medieval wine manor, a low stone house standing above its own rows of vines, a cellar still holding last year's barrels, and somewhere the keys to a life that sounds like a fairy tale come true. You can almost smell the grapes, the wood, the money. You are the lord of a vineyard now. And that can only mean one thing: easy wealth, right? Well, history has a very different receipt for you. Owning a wine estate in the Middle Ages was not a ticket to a comfortable fortune. It was an expensive, delicate, exhausting machine that ate more money than it printed. And by the time you finish this story, you will understand why the ones who truly got rich off the medieval vineyard were almost never the ones who owned it. So let us start at the very beginning. With the fantasy you are buying, a medieval wine manor was never simply a piece of land. It was a bundle of rights, some of them beautiful, some of them quietly ruinous. And if you want to understand the economics, you first have to understand the money itself. So here's the accounting system you will be using. One livre, the pound, divided into 20 sous. Each sou divided into 12 deniers. That made 240 deniers to the livre. And in the ordinary market, the smallest of those coins, the denier, was the coin of everyday life. In ordinary years, a denier could pay for a loaf of bread, a cheap everyday meal, a candle, a small purchase. A full day of labor from sun up to sundown might bring a common worker only a few of those coins, a little more if they were skilled. And here's a confirmed baseline from the history books. In the mid-1400s, the Crown in England set a legal daily wage in its own labor rules. A common plowman or reaper was meant to earn around 2 or 3 pence a day, while a skilled craftsman, a carpenter, or a mason could be paid roughly double or more. These numbers shifted over time and place. But the shape is honest. A day's honest work bought bread and not a whole lot more. And to keep the picture fair, most towns in the big wine regions and across much of Europe actually regulated the price of bread. The authorities set how much a loaf weighed and what it cost based on the current price of grain. So that one denier loaf, the loaf an ordinary person could afford, was not a fantasy. It was a controlled reality. And it is against that humble yardstick that every price in this story will make sense. Because when I tell you a manor cost a fortune, the real question is always a fortune compared to what? So keep that one loaf, that one denier, that one day's work in your mind, and let us price the dream. And the first price is the door price. Buying a working seigneury with its vines, its mill, its tenants, and its rights was a transaction for the wealthy only. A good manor with vineyards sold for hundreds of livres, often more than 1,000, and to feel that a single livre was a serious year's wages for an ordinary worker, so a manor was the price of a working lifetime many times over. Most people never came within sight of that sum. A manor was not a business you casually entered. It was a prize reserved for the already rich, and before we even reach the vines, you should know that it also came with a wardrobe. A great house had to look like a great house. The lord was expected to dress richly, to keep an entourage, to feed and roof the people around them. And every thread of that display was an expense that produced nothing you could sell. The fantasy says you simply own the vines and the gold rolls in. The reality is that the land itself was only the beginning of the bill. A vineyard did not behave like a field of wheat. Wheat grows in a few months and pays you back in a single season. A vine takes years, typically 4 to 5 years after planting, before it produces a serious crop. And even then, the quality climbs slowly. Which means you are pouring money, labor, and land into an asset that mocks you for years before it gives back a single proper vintage. And that is not poetic. That is the balance sheet. While the vine is young, you still pay for the pruning, the tending, the workers, the land tax, the whole time the vineyard returns almost nothing. Modern yields are far higher than anything a medieval plot produced. So the medieval grower worked the same ground for a fraction of the grapes. And there is a second detail that makes the land itself a gamble. Land was measured in rough units like the arpent, a plot roughly the size of an acre, and not every arpent was equal. Hillside vines soaked up the sun and drained the rain and commanded a far higher price than a flat, damp field that might waterlog the roots. So the price of a vineyard could vary wildly. Arpent to arpent, and you were paying for soil, aspect, and reputation years before the wine proved it. Here is a number worth holding. The same coin that bought an ordinary loaf could buy only a small measure of wine. Wine was genuinely valuable, which is exactly why everyone from the church to the crown wanted their cut. And why wine, not water, was the everyday drink of people who could manage it. Water in medieval towns was often not safe to drink. So even modest households drank thin wine and small beer, and the church needed wine every single day for its services, which created a constant, reliable, everyday demand that a crop like wheat never had. Wine was the medieval caffeine, the everyday fuel, and that steady demand is precisely what made the Lord's position look so rich. Before you ever sell a drop, several hands are already reaching into your barrel. The church takes its tithe, share of the harvest. The king takes his taxes, the local power takes its due. And if you are the Lord, well, then it is your own rule book. But rules are expensive, and the most expensive rule of all is the one called the banvin. This is the detail that separates fantasy from finance. In many wine regions, the Lord held a special rite called the banvin for a window of weeks right after the harvest, usually around a month. Only the Lord was allowed to sell wine at all. Everyone else had to wait. At first, this sounds like a gift, a temporary monopoly on the local market, a protected seller's paradise, but the twist is that the Lord had to sell at a set price, a fixed price that was meant to keep wine affordable for the villagers. So your great monopoly came with a ceiling nailed to it. You could not raise the price even when demand was highest. You sold at the official rate while your grapes were fresh and cheap. And after your window closed, all your neighbors rushed to sell, flooding the market and driving the price down further. The banvin was a privilege that was also a trap. It gave you the first turn but forced you to sell cheap, and the merchant who bought from you did not have that problem. And there's a second quiet horror in the wine itself. Medieval wine was not the wine on your shelf. It was young and thin, drunk within the year, and it did not travel well. So the price did not just depend on the soil. It depended on how fast you could move the barrel. A lord with a cellar a day from the nearest town could command a different price than a lord stuck a week from anywhere. The whole geography of the manor was written into the price of its wine and into its bills. Hold that thought. We will come back to the merchant because he is the real winner of this whole story. For now, let us look at the actual workforce because a manor does not run on wishes, it runs on hands. A medieval vineyard was brutally labor-heavy. Every vine needed pruning by hand. Every shoot needed training. Every weed needed pulling. And the harvest, the vendange, was an event that pulled in the whole village. The Lord did not do any of this. The peasants did. And the way they were paid tells you everything about the fragility of the whole enterprise. Many of the workers were tied to the land, owing days of labor service, the corvée to their lord. They worked part of their time for their own plots and part of their time for the landowner without being paid in coin. And the corvée was a strange and rigid thing. It was owed in fixed days, fixed tasks, fixed times of year. The Lord could not simply summon the whole village whenever the whim took them. Custom bound both sides. So an estate wanted more labor at harvest than custom ever allowed, and the shortfall had to be hired at the going wage. This free labor is often romanticized, but it was not free. It was a tax on them, and it came with a cost to the manor too. Forced, resentful, underpaid workers do not produce a delicate vintage. They produce a bare minimum. And if you wanted quality, you had to pay for it in cash, which is where the real wages come in. On the open market, an agricultural worker might earn only a few deniers for a full day. And at harvest time, when every manor competed for the same hands, wages spiked, because everyone needed everyone at once. You might pay a field hand, a grape picker, several times the ordinary daily rate just to get your crop in before the weather turned. A skilled craftsman, a cooper who made the barrels, an expert vine dresser, could command a wage several times that of a common laborer. Their skills were rare, and a manor always needed them. Think about the barrels alone. Wine does not exist as wine until it sits in a good wooden barrel, and those barrels were not cheap. Standard sizes varied by region. A common French wine barrel, the barrique, held roughly 225 liters, while a big merchant tun could hold several times that. And every one of those barrels had to be built by hand, stave by stave, hoop by hoop, by a skilled cooper. And a cooper could easily earn more in a single day than a field laborer earned in several. Year after year, the manor had to keep a whole inventory of barrels, vats, and presses in good condition, and every one of them was handmade. Then there is the shipping problem. Wine is heavy. A barrel of wine weighed far more than the same barrel filled with cloth or grain. So moving at any distance cost real money in carter's fees. Riverboats, tolls, and customs. The lord who sold nearby paid little for transport. But the lord who wanted a city price had to pay for the journey, and that cost ate straight into the margin. A stone house and stone walls may look eternal, but wood rots, iron rusts, roofs leak, And a manor was a factory with a castle's face on it. Every season brought a bill, and those bills had a way of arriving right when your cash was lowest. Because a manor, for all its grandeur, was chronically short of actual coin. The peasants paid much of their obligation in kind, in grain, in eggs, in cheese, in labor, not in shiny metal. So the Lord's real money, the deniers and sous that could pay a tax collector or a hired craftsman, was always scarce. You could sit on a fortune in firewood and chickens and still not have the 18 pennies to pay for a new hinge. That is the paradox of medieval wealth. It was everywhere and useless at the moment you needed it. And it is precisely at that moment that the costs arrive. So let us now do the arithmetic. Catalog the income first and watch it dissolve. The first income is the banvin we already met, a fixed price, time-limited sale of your own wine. The second is the banalities, the Lord's monopolies over the mill, the oven, the wine press. Peasants were not allowed to build their own. They had to bring their grain to your mill, their dough to your oven, their grapes to your press, and pay you a share or a fee for the privilege. The mill in particular took a set portion of the grain it ground. A real and measurable slice of every loaf in the village passed through the Lord's hands. This sounds like a license to print money, and in a good year it genuinely was. But it also came with obligations. The mill had to be maintained, the miller had to be paid, and if the equipment broke at harvest, you lost the whole season and the loyalty of everyone around you. Then there is the direct tax the Lord could collect from his own people, who owed rent, and the share the tenants owed from what they grew. A portion of the grain, a portion of the fruit, a portion of the wine, and that share was your annuity, stable, reliable, and utterly dependent on the weather. One bad frost, one wet summer, one hailstorm on the wrong afternoon, and your entire income collapses because you get paid in crops and crops fail, and there is no insurance, no reserve, no bank to smooth the blow. A lord carried the full weather risk alone, and weather sat in charge of the vineyard the way an owner never could. Nobody in the village needed to be told what a spoiled vintage meant. The mouths still had to be fed, the rents still had to be paid, the lord still owed their dues at court, and yet the grapes were gone. That is the fragility written into the very name of the trade. And finally, there is justice. The Lord's court had the power to fine people, and those fines for a dozen small offenses were a real and steady trickle of cash. And before you think every barrel tasted the same, quality was its own separate economy. A thin young wine for the workman, and the table sat at one price, while a richer, darker, more careful wine, stored to be sipped at court and given as gifts, sat at a price several times higher. And that top barrel was the one everyone in the story wanted to control. The monks and the merchants fought politely over exactly those wines, because prestige wine sold not by the jug but by the reputation of its cellar. So add it all together: wine sales at a fixed price, mill and oven and press fees, rent in kind, court fines. And it sounds like a fortune, but now subtract the tithe. The church's claim on a tenth of the land's produce. Subtract the king's taxes and the tallage that could be levied on your tenants. Subtract the army, because here is an expense nobody puts on the postcard. In return for holding land, the Lord owed the king. Military service, knights, soldiers, horses, armor, all had to be raised, equipped, and paid. And a good war horse alone cost more than most workers earned in a year, sometimes several years. So the Lord's social contract with the crown was a standing bill for weapons and men that had to be paid in coin. In the right season, whether the harvest was good or not, then subtract hospitality, because in the Middle Ages a great house was expected to feed its guests, its followers, its visitors, and the obligation of generosity was not a choice. It was the price of standing. A lord who skimped on the feast was a lord who lost face and status, and therefore income. So the manor fed its people while the pantry said otherwise, and then subtract the maintenance we already mentioned. The roofs, the barrels, the press, the gear, and now you can see the ledger. Broad income on the left, deep expense on the right, and in the middle, if you were lucky, a whisper of surplus. And if you were not, a growing debt. And debt was the quiet shadow over every wine manor, because when the harvest failed, and it failed often, the Lord had no rainy day fund. They borrowed, they mortgaged the land to a lender, a merchant, a richer church, and those loans had interest, and the collateral was the vineyard itself. One bad decade in the manor that had stood in the family for generations slipped away, piece by piece, barrel by barrel, to whoever held the note. And this is the heart of the whole story. So many of the great vineyards of medieval Europe did not stay in the hands of the lords who were born to them. They ended up in the hands of the people who could actually run the numbers, and the greatest of those people were the monks. Everyone imagines medieval monks as quiet scholars murmuring in candlelight, and many were, but the Cistercian order was one of the most skilled and methodical managers in medieval Europe. And the church as a whole held a striking share of the best vineyards, abbeys, cathedrals, and priories, all needed a steady supply of wine for their own tables and altars. So they bought the good hillsides, rented out the rest, and turned religious duty into a durable income. Their most famous project was the Clos de Vougeot, a walled vineyard in Burgundy, covering an area close to 50 hectares that the monks of the Abbey of Citeaux developed over many generations. They did not inherit a fortune, they built one. Acre by acre, row by row, until their vineyard became one of the most celebrated in all of France. And they could do it because their economics were simply better than the Lord's. For one thing, the monks were exempt from many of the taxes and tithes that weighed on the lay lord. The church levied a tenth on the land, but a series of papal privileges spared the Cistercians from paying tithes on the new lands they brought into cultivation. So a Cistercian vineyard kept more of every harvest than a lord's vineyard did. For another thing, the monks supplied their own disciplined labor. The brothers themselves worked the land, methodically, year after year. No angry corvée, no underpaid resentful pickers. A community of focused people who took notes, who observed the soil, who selected the best vines and replanted them, who turned viticulture into a science centuries before the word existed, and the numbers followed, an estate that did not lose a tenth to the church, did not waste a wage on reluctant labor, and did not pay interest on crushing debt. Simply had more coin left at the end of the season. It could reinvest that coin in better barrels, a better press, more land, and the cycle compounded, while the Lord's harvest was drained dry by the taxman, the tithe collector, the armorer, and the feast. And because they were permanent and patient, they could play the long game that no cash-poor lord could afford. A lord borrowed at ruinous rates and sold young wine cheap to pay the tax collector. A monastery held its barrels, aged the wine, waited for the price to rise, and sold at the right moment. That patience was profit, and it is one of the reasons the great monastic vineyards of Burgundy became the blueprint for everything that followed. So now we finally meet the true master of the manor, the merchant. The wine merchant was the one player in this story who understood that money is made in the gap between grower and drinker, the Lord. Trapped by the banvin in the harvest, sold his wine young, local and cheap. The merchant bought low, stored the wine, transported it, and sold it in the city. In the tavern, in the houses of the wealthy, at a price that could be several times what the Lord received. Wine was heavy, fragile, and slow, so transport was expensive and risk was real. A barrel that sat too long could turn. A ruined boat could take a season's harvest with it. A toll bridge could double the cost of a journey, and the merchant absorbed all of that. But he also absorbed the reward. The margin was enormous enough that the merchant, not the Lord, accumulated the fortune, and the scale of the trade tells the same story. The great wine ports of the Atlantic coast sent thousands of barrels across the sea every season, and the money that flowed back enriched the towns, not the hills. The Lord ran the vineyard, the merchant ran the market, and the market is where the actual money lived. By the later Middle Ages, a growing class of wealthy town merchants and lenders had more ready cash than most aristocrats. And they did exactly what you would expect. They bought the manor houses, the vineyards, the incomes, the land that the cash-poor lords had to sell at a loss, so the countryside was quietly changing hands, not by conquest, but by arithmetic. The lords faded under the weight of their own obligations, and the wine flowed into a town economy that knew how to price it, which brings us at last to the verdict. So was owning a medieval wine manor. A good deal. Well, let us close the books with real prices on both sides. On the income side, the Lord counted the fixed price wine of the banvin, the mill and oven and press fees drawn from every household, the rents and shares in kind, and the trickle of court fines. And on the cost side, the Lord counted the tithe, 10 measures out of every 100 off the top, the royal taxes and tallage, the standing bill of knights and horses that with one good war horse could exceed a full year's wages for a working family, the endless bread of hospitality, and the iron and oak of eternal repair. And when the ledger closed on an ordinary year, the two sides came close to evening out. And that is the whole uncomfortable truth. The manor was not a fortune machine. It was a treadmill. It paid for itself in a good year and quietly went backwards in a bad one. And it went backwards often, because the whole enterprise hung on one uncontrollable variable. The weather, one bad vintage, and the income halved while the fixed costs marched on. The army still had to be paid, the roof still leaked, the church still took its tenth of whatever survived. So the romantic image of the Lord growing rich on the fruit of the vine was, for the most part, a fantasy. The people who truly prospered from the medieval vineyard were the patient ones who held the note, ran the numbers, and controlled the moment of sale, the monks who built the great estates, and the merchants who moved the wine to where it was worth more. The Lord supplied the land, the labor and the risk, and the market supplied the profit. And if that sounds like an old story, look around. The same pattern repeats in every era. And yet the wine manor endured as the great symbol of wealth for centuries, which is its own quiet little mystery. Why did everyone want what so few could make pay? Because a manor was never really bought for the money it would earn. It was bought for what it said about the owner. It was a title, a name, a seat at every table that mattered. A manor made you somebody in a world where most people were nobody. And nobody ever bought a manor to be a good business person. They bought it to be someone with stone and pedigree and a view of their own hills. Economics won the argument on paper, and prestige won it in the heart, so you can understand why the lords held on. And why the monks and merchants who actually ran the ledgers did not need to hold on. They just needed to keep the vineyard behind the beautiful walls. So the next time you daydream about owning a little vineyard in the hills, remember the account. Remember the fixed price of the banvin, the tithe, the tax, the armor, the feast, the roof. And ask yourself one honest question. Are you the Lord, or are you quietly the merchant? That is the real romance, not the stones and the grapes, but the person who understands that a vineyard is not a treasure, it is a business. And the ones who treat it like a business, who keep the books like the monks did, who sell at the right time like the merchants did, they are the ones who actually walk away with the coin. So if you enjoyed this trip into the vineyard's ledgers, hit subscribe. Drop a comment telling me which historical money scheme you found most surprising, and let the story of the wine go on. Because next time we might open the ledger on something even stranger. The economics of a medieval castle town, a cathedral, or a market fair. Until then, keep your coin safe, keep your barrel full, and remember, the oldest trick in the book is to own the land. But the real money was always in the wine that left it, and in the person who knew where it was going. And that simple skill of reading a market, of timing a sale, of knowing the true value of a thing better than its own owner, never once went out of fashion. Not then, not now, not ever. Thank you for listening, and I will see you in the next one.